Hello and welcome to the Adult Care New Planning Process webinar. You've been sent this webinar as you're currently working with Innovate Awarding for the endpoint assessment of your adult care apprentices. We're going to be talking today about a new process which will be commencing from the 1st of February 2021. You'll hear from myself, Jessica Fowler, Client Relationship Manager, and also from Lynn Walsh, who is our Endpoint Assessment Manager for the adult care sector. So following feedback around the current process for endpoint assessment in the adult care sector, we've looked at the process to ensure we can improve the apprentice experience of endpoint assessment. The efficiency of planning is something we focused on, and removing the Innovate Awarding planning meeting from this process is really going to support with ensuring a timely journey, reducing the overall time from gateway to certification. The new planning process, which will be called version 2 in your documentation, is going to allow more flexibility for the apprentice, employer and provider, and will enable the MCQ to take place 3 working days after the completion of the Gateway Review in EPA Pro. There will also be increased flexibility for the professional discussion being booked in directly with the endpoint assessor. I'm now going to hand over to Lynn, who will talk through how the process is going to work.
Thanks, Jess. Okay, so I'm Lynn Walsh, and I'm just going to talk you through the process for the bookings of the assessments. Okay, so if we start by looking at the provider would submit the gateway. So the gateway would be submitted as it would normally be submitted when the apprentice has completed the entire apprenticeship and is ready for gateway. So this must be completed and put through gateway a minimum of 3 working days prior to the proposed MCQ date. What needs to be on that gateway is the invigilation identification form, and on that form there does need to be the date that you require the MCQ test, time of the MCQ test, and whether this needs to be taken face-to-face or remotely. And the name of the invigilation should also be on the form. So once the gateway has been submitted, as it normally would be, this then comes through to Innovate Awarding as normal. And where the process changes here slightly is that we now at Innovate only have 2 working days to be able to make sure that that gateway is accepted. Or rejected, whichever the case may be. If for any reason the gateway is actually rejected, what would happen at this point is the endpoint assessor would email the on-programme provider and they would let the on-programme assessor know what the issues were to be able to rectify the gateway, at which point the provider would need to amend whatever gateway documents were required to be amended, and then the provider would resubmit the gateway and the process would start again. Obviously at this point the apprentice would already be allocated, so there would be no further need to reallocate at that point. If the gateway is accepted and everything's absolutely fine on the gateway, the endpoint assessor will then add the planning meeting onto our EPA Pro system. And what will happen is the EPA would be looking at the gateway documents, and during that time they will also be booking in the MCQ test, which would be on the gateway form. So at this point, when the endpoint assessor books the MCQ test onto EPA Pro, what will happen is the key code will be automatically generated and sent out to the invigilator that was identified on the form. And what will also happen at this point is the endpoint assessor will also send out a welcome email, and attached to the welcome email will be the endpoint assessor's bio. What we've also included at this point on the endpoint assessor's bio is their telephone number, which will actually be quite useful to the apprentices and the on-programme assessor, because if there's any issues, any problems, that also means that the apprentice does have a telephone number for the endpoint assessor. So once the MCQ test has been booked onto EPA Pro, what will also happen is the endpoint assessor will set up the Adobe attendance register, and that will also be sent out, usually with the welcome email, to the invigilator. And also at the same time, the endpoint assessor will set up a SharePoint folder, and that SharePoint folder will be sent to the invigilator to be able to upload the recording for the MCQ. So apprentice would then sit the MCQ once that had been booked in. Once the MCQ has been sat, the provider would need to upload any invigilation documents and recordings to the SharePoint folder that have been set up and sent out by the endpoint assessor. What will happen then is there would be approximately 2 to 3 days that there may be a little bit of a wait, and the reason for this is because the MCQ recording has to be checked by our compliance department during the COVID crisis. And at that point, once the recording has been checked, and if the recording for the MCQ is fine, then what will happen is compliance will sign off the MCQ and the result can be released. So once the result is released, the endpoint assessor, providing the MCQ test has been passed, then the endpoint assessor will contact the apprentice directly to book in the professional discussion. What will happen then is if they can't contact the apprentice, notes will be made on the profile for the apprentice. They will try again. They will try emailing the apprentice as well. They will try telephoning a few times, and obviously they'll leave voicemails as well. Once they've tried contacting the apprentice 3 times over a couple of days, if they still cannot contact the apprentice to book in the professional discussion, they will contact the on-programme trainer. So once the discussion is actually booked in and verified, then that would be booked onto EPA Pro as normal. Okay, so if we actually look at what has actually changed for you as providers, okay, so what we've done is we actually listened to feedback from our clients around planning meetings, and some of the feedback that we actually got was that planning meetings could be quite burdensome. So as a result of this, what we found as well is from the assessment plan for the sector that the planning meetings are not actually mandatory requirement for this sector. So what we looked at, as Jess said at the beginning, is to make some improvements to the process. And this included removing the internal planning meeting with our central bookings team. So this being said, it is still really important to ensure as a provider that your learners still understand the process of endpoint assessment and what's included in the endpoint assessment. So key really is a small planning meeting with yourself prior to the gateway, and this would really support and clarify with your learners what would be included in the endpoint assessment. But it also provides an opportunity for any final checks, and also to check whether there would be any reasonable adjustments for your learners as well. So just to reiterate, it would be really beneficial to complete a planning meeting with the apprentices to determine any sort of suitable assessment dates for them. We do have some exemplar scripts for you to use, and they will be supplied to you. So on the gateway review on EPA Pro, we do need the date and time, as we mentioned before, for the invigilation, and as well the planning meeting request form field on the gateway review on EPA Pro will be removed on the 1st of February for the adult care standards. So at the moment there is a field for the planning meeting form, and as I just said, when it comes to the 1st of February under this process that we're now moving to, that will now be removed.
So just to cover the timeline for the change, from the 1st of February, no planning meetings will be booked in for adult care. Any apprentices who have been submitted through the gateway before the 1st of February, a planning meeting will be required on the current process, and so any planning meetings that have been booked will be honoured by the central bookings team. Thank you for listening to the webinar today. If you do have any questions or you'd like to have a discussion with us about it, please get in touch with your client relationship contact. We'll be more than happy to support you with any questions.